You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Hi, everyone. I welcome you to our today's podcast. We are from the German-Hungarian Institute of MCC, and our today's guest is Professor Dominik Geppert, who has two very interesting research topics. The one is the British conservatism, and the other one is the future of the euro. Now, Mr. Geppert, I would like to start with your first research area, the British conservatism. As I have already read, one of your main points is the program of the Tories from Benjamin Disraeli to Boris Johnson, and the question of how liberal the British conservatism actually is. Can you briefly outline what the distinctive features of British conservatism are, to what extent it can be defined as liberal, and why the Tories program is so important for our times?
Yeah, I think if you go back to Benjamin Disraeli's time, to the 19th century, conservatism was the opposite of liberalism. So there was one party of progress, that was liberalism, the Liberal Party, and then there was a party of tradition and of keeping things as they are, and that were the Conservatives or the Tories. That changed in the beginning of the 20th century, when the Liberal Party disappeared more or less from the stage of British politics and was replaced by the Labour Party, so by a socialist, social democratic party of the working class. And in the wake of this monumental shift, the Tories, the Conservative Party, picked up some of the remains of liberalism. So they included in the 20th century important parts of the liberal tradition. Most importantly, probably economic liberalism and Thatcherism in the 1980s was kind of the high time of this kind of liberal. Economically liberal conservatism. And in more recent years, so after Thatcher, there has again been a shift slightly away from a radical economic liberalism, more back to one-nation Toryism, as it is called in Britain. Thought that conservatives should look after the society as a whole, to keep the society together. And in this sense, already David Cameron kind of tried to reinvent conservatism without completely abandoning Thatcherism or economic liberalism. And Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister, shifted conservatism even further, partly because the British Conservatives with Brexit became the party of the working class areas, which had voted for Brexit, but traditionally had not voted conservatism, but now voted for the Brexit party. So in a way, the Conservatives today in northern England, in parts of northern and in the northeast England, the Tories are the new working class party with a more social democratic outlook in some respects. So it's an interesting conglomeration nowadays, and the idea is probably again to keep the country, the union of the United Kingdom and the society together.
Could you also answer the question if I ask how does the British conservatism differ from, for example, the German and Hungarian conservatism?
Well, about Hungarian conservatism, I don't know so much. So perhaps you would have to tell me afterwards what the distinctive features of Hungarian conservatism are. I think as regards comparison between German and British conservatism, there, of course, is the big caesura, the break of National Socialism and the Hitler dictatorship and the Second World War, which in a way discredited conservatism, not completely, but to a great extent for a long period of time in post-war Germany. And the center-right party in the Federal Republic of Germany after 1949 or 1945 was the Christian Democratic Party. And that was a party very much in the tradition of the Catholic Center Party, so a party rooted in political Catholicism, which had already existed in the German Empire and then in the interwar period. But after 45, the idea was to include not only Catholics, but Protestant Christians as well. So it became a Christian party, an ecumenic party, a party that brought the two confessions of Lutheran Protestantism and Catholicism together. And so there were some important from these distinctive features. So Christian faith and the break of the National Socialism were probably the main reasons or the main points where German center-right and the British center-right differed. The German center-right wouldn't, for a long period of time, wouldn't call itself conservative, but Christian Democrat. It was more geared towards consensus in a federal system where you needed coalitions to govern, where you needed to make offers to other parties to work together. That was more important in Germany, where plus there existed a liberal party, the Free Democrats in Germany, which went into a coalition for long periods of time with the Christian Democrats. So there was not the kind of merger I spoke about that we had in British conservatism. And of course, there was not the uninterrupted tradition of conservatism reaching back to the 18th, 19th century as in Britain, because there was a big break, break in civilization because of the National Socialist dictatorship.
In your opinion, what kind of future lies ahead for British conservatism?
Well, as a historian, you're always reluctant to speak about the future. But I think the biggest challenge for Boris Johnson's Tories is probably twofold. The first is to kind of deal with the consequences of Brexit, to kind of reinvent British economy, which is not longer any part of the customs union and the common market of the European Union. And this will bring very important, or has already brought very important changes, and there lay challenges ahead in the future. Especially so if you think that in our new world post-COVID, confronted with a Russian war against Ukraine, a new kind of bipolarism between authoritarian countries, Russia and China on the one hand, and more Western market-oriented countries in the West. The idea of globalization has suffered some very serious blows. So in this difficult context, to re-establish, to reinvent British economic policy and make a success out of it is the one big challenge. And the other one is probably keeping the United Kingdom together, because Brexit has, I think, the power to pose a serious threat to the Union, with at least with Scotland, and probably more importantly, the question of Ireland. So there is a serious problem with keeping the union of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland together. And that is, I think, to reinvent the Tory party, the Conservative Party, as the Unionist party, the party of the United Kingdom, is a very challenging task.
Now let's jump to your other research area, the future of the euro. What kind of future might we predict for the euro? Can we speak of different scenarios?
Yeah, I think the euro has always had a very difficult future, because it was started as a common currency by European countries which had very, very different cultural traditions of monetary, of currency policy. So these different traditions survived, although there was now a common currency. And in my opinion, the biggest kind of alternatives are a French way, if you like, and a German way. The French way ahead for the euro would be to supplement the existent state of affairs with a more active economic and fiscal policy, a kind of economic government, if you like, more transfer payments between European countries to kind of deal with the disparities in the currency area. On the other hand, there is a German way, if you like, which would try to get back to the Maastricht Treaty and say we don't need a central fiscal or economic policy. The European Union is not a central state, so we don't need a central economic policy, but we have all to stick to the rules of the treaties, which we have all signed. So one is, if you like, the German way ahead would be in the tradition of a federal country, and federalism relies very much not on strong central government, but on common rules which are agreed upon, and then every unit of the federal entity sticks to it. So these are, I think, and this would imply not a reversion to huge transfer payments, but still the idea that every country had to look after its own finances. I think this is the more or less the alternatives that lay ahead. And if you ask me, I think the more probable alternative is probably the French way.
Can you briefly outline how the monetary union was achieved and what reasons were decisive for its establishment at that time?
The first ideas of a common currency reach as far back as the late 1960s, early 1970s. But in the turbulent times with the breakdown of the system of Bretton Woods, various currencies pegged to the dollar, that was nothing that could actually be put into reality, turned into reality. So the ideas of the so-called Werner Plan of 1970, and the successor ideas of the European monetary system, for example, of the late 1970s, did not lead to much. So It was only in the late 1980s, 10 years later, that the actual breakthrough was achieved. And that was partly because French President François Mitterrand had made it an important point of his economic policy to kind of Europeanize the German currency, the D-Mark, which had become the most important currency in the European community at the time. The French, for good reasons, wanted to have a say in currency policy as well. So they said it's not good that currency policy is made in Germany alone for the whole of the European community, and try to kind of Europeanize currency policy. For the federal government in Germany, I think it was a political question to go ahead with the process of European integration, to prove themselves good Europeans. And in the end, Chancellor Helmut Kohl and his foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, agreed to the French plans, even before German unity was achieved, or even before the wall came down in the GDR and the implosion of the Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Central Europe. But of course, the question of German unification played an important role in speeding things up, in establishing a fixed frame, a time frame for the implementation of the common currency. Plus, it separated the ideas of currency union and political union, which the Germans had always thought were two sides of the same coin. So political union and currency union had to go together, whereas the French say we start with currency union and we'll see what kind of aspect of political union can be achieved. And that was in the end the way forward. And this is why in Maastricht in the early 1990s, the member states of the European Community and then the European Union agreed upon a current currency, and then it was put into place as an actual currency you could take into your hands in the early 2000s.
And what were the most important factors that led practically to the introduction of the euro in 2002? What role did Germany have in this process?
Yeah, as I said, I think there were 3 or 4 important considerations. One was to improve or to develop Franco-German understanding. A second consideration was to deepen European integration, not only between France and Germany, but in a broader European context. Then there was the economic consideration that having different interest rates and various currencies was an obstacle to a more intra-European trade, because countries and companies would have to look after various kind of currency rates and so on, and there was seen as an uncertainty in a way, which could be avoided by having a single currency. Not everyone would agree on this point, but I think it was a consideration at the time. And the fourth point probably was that the Europeans wanted to have something as a counterweight or alternative to the US dollar as a reserve currency on the global stage, so to speak. I think these were probably the 4 most important considerations. And as I said, things were speeded up by German unification in 1989, 1990.
Currently, we are experiencing a period of very high inflation. For example, in Germany, it reached 7.3% in March 2022. What are the implications for the future of the monetary union? Could this even mean the end of the euro in the medium long term?
I think higher inflation poses a threat to societies, to economic systems and to currencies and to countries all in the world, all over the world. And it's all the more grave because we had thought inflation had gone. I mean, it was not a serious problem, had not been a serious problem for several decades. It nearly disappeared since the early to mid 1990s, and now it reappears. But I think the challenge for the Euro area is probably especially grave or especially difficult because there is, as I said, there is not one economic policy, there is not one fiscal policy, and the European Central Bank, by sometimes trying desperately to keep the euro together, has used most instruments in its arsenal already, and it's very difficult now for the ECB to kind of put into place new measures to really counter inflation. And I think at the current situation, there are actually two tendencies which are conflicting. The one tendency is that there is higher inflation and a European Central Bank which has to look after the currency stability would actually have to put to higher inflation rates, to higher interest rates. This is the one tendency. And the other tendency is the economic difficulties, the fear of a recession, post-COVID, and in front of the background of the Russian war in Ukraine. And this would say anything is good apart from higher interest rates. So keeping interest rates near the 0 point to kind of get the economies running or get them back onto its feet. So it's a very, very difficult scenario. But I think in the immediate to midterm future, it will not probably not split the euro up. In the long term, we are all dead. I don't know.
If you look at the euro's success story objectively, what do you think are the three most important achievements?
Well, I think what I said about the main strategic goals behind the implementation of the euro probably have at least partly been success stories, but only in part. So if you look at Franco-German relations, it certainly helped the French and other European countries to kind of adapt to the idea of a united Germany, which was a big step for them, and if you like, a revolution in European geopolitics. So that helped, but it did not lead to completely tensions in Franco-German relations completely disappearing. So because there were, as I said, different cultural traditions of currency policy. So in a way, the problems simply were transformed and came up in another way. So that's partly a success story, but partly new problems or old problems in new clothes came up. The European Currency Union certainly deepened the process of European integration, but it created new tensions between southern European countries with higher debts and northern European countries with lower debts and as I said, different traditions and policies. So again, partly a success story, deepening integration, and partly a process of creating new problems. On the world stage, the euro has become not an actual counterweight or an alternative to the dollar, but it has established itself on the world stage as a second or third global currency. So, as always, probably in history, there are partly good things and successes, and partly new problems. And there's a saying that has successful politicians leave behind for their successors different problems than the ones they have found. And I think this is true for the euro as well.
Thank you very much for your answers, Professor Geppert. And I hope you liked the podcast as well, those of you who were listening. Thank you very much.
Okay, I thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this MCC Podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.